Welcome back to Talk Testimonies, everybody. Today we're tackling a case. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, Carpenter v. Murphy. And the crux of it is really a fascinating question. Does the Muscogee Creek Nation in eastern Oklahoma still have, a reservation? Legally speaking, of course. It all hinges on whether their historical boundaries are still recognized under federal criminal law. And, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got centuries of history and legal precedent to consider here.
Yeah.
When you boil it down, though, the heart of the arguments presented to the court was really about how to interpret treaties made, way back when, alongside a whole bunch of actions that Congress took regarding the land that eventually became eastern Oklahoma. The petitioner, in this case, their argument was that Congress had essentially dissolved the reservation status of that land. They pointed to a lot of different actions that happened as Oklahoma became a state, and even afterwards that they felt supported that view. But of course, the other side disagreed.
Right. And their argument was that Congress never formally disestablished the reservation. It never took those explicit legal steps to actually end it. So you've got these two very different readings of the historical record, both, presented by skilled legal teams. And I have to say, listening to the oral arguments, it was really striking how much the justices seemed to be grappling with the weight of legal precedent, especially cases like Solem. They also kept circling back to the reality on the ground today. Eastern Oklahoma has a substantial non-native population now and, fully functioning state and local governments. You could sense some skepticism from the justices about whether considering this a reservation still made sense after so much time had passed and things had changed so dramatically.
You definitely picked up on something important there. There's this tension between the legal principles at play and the very practical implications of however the court decides to rule. If we were to put on our hypothetical 10th justice hat for a moment, consider ourselves part of that deliberation, I think we'd likely find ourselves agreeing with the 10th Circuit.
Which ruled, if I remember correctly, that.
Yeah, the 10th Circuit's ruling was that the Muscogee Nation's reservation boundaries, those historical boundaries, are still in effect. They do still constitute a reservation in eastern Oklahoma. And I think the biggest factor for us in reaching that conclusion would be the lack of that clear expression of congressional intent to disestablish the reservation.
Right, because that's the key legal test, isn't it? There has to be that clear intention from Congress to actually end the reservation.
Exactly, and that's where the petitioner's argument ran into some trouble. I mean, the practical situation on the ground might have changed significantly, but legally speaking, the bar for disestablishment is very high.
So let's walk through how the petitioner's legal team built their case, because I think it'll help make that legal bar clearer. Their argument was that as Oklahoma moved towards statehood, there was this deliberate process of undermining the sovereignty of the Muscogee Creek Nation. One of the key things they pointed to was the allotment policy.
Right, and just to clarify for our listeners, allotment involved breaking up what had been communally held tribal land and assigning parcels to individual tribal members. The idea, at least on the government side, was to encourage assimilation and individual land ownership.
And the petitioner argued that this was part of a larger effort to diminish tribal authority. They highlighted other congressional actions, too, like abolishing tribal courts and ending the tribe's power to tax its members. They basically argued that all of these things together demonstrated that the reservation had effectively ceased to exist.
It was a pretty comprehensive argument. But Justice Sotomayor, during the oral arguments, she didn't let them get away with being vague about the timeline. She really pressed their lawyer on when exactly they believed disestablishment had happened. She was particularly interested in the fact that the tribe continued to exist and that tribal members still held land even after Oklahoma achieved statehood. Her line of questioning really zeroed in on whether there was a clear and unambiguous moment when the reservation could be said to have been dissolved.
And as you mentioned earlier, a lot of the discussion hinged on previous Supreme Court decisions, especially Solem v. United States. The petitioner tried to argue that Solem and other similar cases were different because they only dealt with the federal government taking surplus land that wasn't owned by Native Americans. They claimed that the history of Oklahoma was unique because there was this much more comprehensive dismantling of tribal sovereignty across the board.
And that was a crucial point for them to try and make. Because if Solem was seen as directly applicable, their whole argument kind of falls apart. But Justice Kagan wasn't really buying it. She pushed back, pointing out that it was a common historical pattern for the federal government to chip away at tribal powers over time. Just because that happened, she argued, didn't automatically mean a reservation was disestablished. She reminded them that the core question in Solem was specifically whether Congress had acted to reduce the physical size of the reservation by giving up land.
Right, so it really comes down to the land itself. And this is where Justice Alito's question really stood out to me. He wanted to know if the key issue in Solem was the complete disestablishment of the tribe as a political entity or just the end of its sovereign authority over a specific area. It gets at the heart of what it means for a reservation to exist, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Is it about the land itself being set aside, or is it about the tribe's ability to exercise governmental power? That distinction was really at play throughout the entire Carpenter case.
And we should mention, it wasn't just the petitioner making arguments. The U.S. government also weighed in. The Deputy Solicitor General argued in support of the petitioner's view, and their argument, if I'm remembering this right, really emphasized the way Congress intentionally worked to transform Oklahoma from a territory with tribal domain into a full-fledged state on equal footing with all the others.
Yeah, that was a big part of their argument. They highlighted the fact that Arkansas law was applied to everyone living in the territory, regardless of whether they were Native American or not. And they pointed to the abolition of tribal courts as further evidence of this transition away from tribal authority. Their point was Congress was setting up a state with its own complete system of government.
And then Justice Sotomayor, she always brings up those insightful points. She questioned whether the intention was really to transfer all criminal cases to state courts when Oklahoma became a state. She pointed to the language of the Enabling Act, the law that actually made statehood possible. Her argument was that cases involving federal questions, especially those falling under the Major Crimes Act, those are certain serious crimes by Native Americans on, what's considered Indian country. Those were supposed to stay in federal court.
Her point there is so important because it highlights the complexities of jurisdiction. Even back at the time of statehood, figuring out who had the authority to prosecute what crimes wasn't simple.
Right, and that gets into some of the really, potentially huge ramifications of the 10th Circuit ruling. If their decision stands, if the reservation is still in effect, there are major questions about jurisdiction over crimes involving Native Americans in eastern Oklahoma. You've got potential shifts in who prosecutes those crimes, concerns about whether the feds and tribal authorities would even have the resources to handle more cases, questions about the legality of past state convictions. It's a lot.
Definitely. Plus the possible tax implications for tribal members living within those historical boundaries. It could have a significant impact on, the lives of a lot of people.
So how did the respondents' team, the ones arguing the reservation still exists, how did they tackle all of this?
Well, they came back swinging, really leaning on Supreme Court precedent. They cited Nebraska v. Parker, a relatively recent case, to emphasize that when it comes to these kinds of questions, the actual text of the law is what matters most. And they argued that in all the various laws concerning the Muscogee Creek Nation, Congress never used that clear, unmistakable language of disestablishment that they'd used elsewhere. Instead, they focused on allotment, on dividing up the land, and they claimed this showed Congress's intent to preserve tribal authority in some form. They pointed specifically to the Five Tribes Act of 1906 to support their argument.
And this is the act that basically set up the framework for Oklahoma becoming a state, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was a really consequential piece of legislation.
And Justice Breyer, he seemed to accept that there was something to the respondent's point about that 1906 act. But he did raise a question about exactly how much tribal authority was actually preserved by that law, especially considering other parts of the act that seemed to limit tribal powers. And, his point really highlights the importance of looking at the whole picture, the full context of these laws.
Definitely. You can't just cherry pick a single sentence or section and claim it settles the issue. The respondent countered by really zeroing in on a specific part of that Five Tribes Act, Section 28. That section explicitly says that tribal governments will continue to exist for all the purposes authorized by law. They also brought in some important historical context, pointing out that there was a lot of pushback from the executive branch, the president and various federal agencies, against tribal authority at the time. So you have to understand the political climate of the era to fully understand these laws.
And then they really wanted to drive home the point that tribal authority did continue, even after statehood. They provided examples of tribal legislative actions, like the tribe approving its own budgets and working on issues related to making land allotments more fair and equitable. Their argument was, look, the tribe kept governing itself, even if it wasn't in the exact same way as before. Now, a lot of the justices, and I'm sure this is no surprise, They were really concerned about the practical consequences of the 10th Circuit ruling. They asked a lot about what would happen to existing local regulations and property ownership if the reservation was affirmed. I mean, you've got 1.8 million people living in the area. What happens to zoning laws and land titles and things like that?
It's a valid concern. And it's not like it wasn't brought up during the arguments. The respondent, though, they argued that those concerns were probably exaggerated. They pointed to legal doctrines like laches, which basically deals with unreasonable delays in asserting a legal right. The idea is, if the state has been operating in a certain way for a long time and no one's challenged it, it might be too late to suddenly overturn everything. They also mentioned the City of Sherrill case, a Supreme Court decision that tackled similar issues of jurisdiction after changes in land status. Their main argument was that figuring out whether or not a reservation exists, that's a separate legal question from how you deal with all the practical implications that might come after.
And just to add to that, even the definition of who's considered Indian for legal purposes, that came up too.
Right, because that has huge implications for who's subject to tribal law and who falls under federal jurisdiction. It's not always a straightforward answer.
And one of the things the petitioner had pointed to was the fact that Oklahoma, historically, hasn't really acknowledged the existence of the reservation. But then the respondent came back with the Muscogee Creek Nation's own 1979 Constitution, the one that the Secretary of the Interior approved. That Constitution directly asserts the tribe's jurisdiction over its territory.
They also highlighted those cross-deputization agreements, the ones that exist between the nation and the state. Those are agreements that basically allow law enforcement agencies from different jurisdictions to work together, to have authority in each other's territories. Mm-hmm. And the fact that those agreements exist suggests some level of recognition of tribal jurisdiction.
Absolutely. And then there's that whole issue of how the Muscogee Creek Nation got their land in the first place. If I remember correctly, they received it as fee patent, right? Like private ownership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was another point of contention. The petitioner saw it as evidence that there wasn't a reservation from the beginning. But the respondent actually flipped that around and argued that the fact that they received the land in fee patent just strengthens their argument that a reservation did exist initially. Their logic was, well, if there wasn't a reservation in the first place, there wouldn't have been any land to give them as fee patent.
That makes sense. And they also, throughout the arguments, kept coming back to all those historical references to the Creek Reservation in treaties and federal laws. It was almost like they were saying, look, it's been called a reservation all along. How can you argue it doesn't exist?
Right. They were really trying to establish that historical continuity, that idea that there's a clear line from those early treaties and laws to the situation today.
And we also heard from the Muscogee Creek Nation themselves. They acted as a friend of the court, meaning they weren't directly involved in the case, but presented their own arguments in support of the respondent.
And their argument was pretty interesting. They basically said, look, if the 10th Circuit's ruling is upheld, it's not going to lead to this huge upheaval that everyone seems to be worried about. They cited legal precedents that allow tribal governments to exercise some authority, even over land within their reservations, that's now owned in fee simple by non-Native Americans. And they also highlighted all those cooperative agreements that already exist between the nation and Oklahoma. They were basically saying, we already have a framework for working together. This isn't going to cause chaos.
It was almost like they were trying to reassure the court that affirming the 10th Circuit ruling wouldn't necessarily lead to this huge jurisdictional nightmare.
Exactly. They wanted to emphasize that this wasn't about upending the status quo, but about recognizing an existing reality. And they argued that the Muscogee Creek Nation's court system was perfectly capable of handling any increase in cases that might come their way.
I think that's a key point. It wasn't just about legal arguments, it was about practical capabilities too.
Absolutely. And they also did something really smart, I thought. They brought up examples of other reservations across the country where the tribal governments have had, varying levels of authority throughout history. The point they were making was that just because a tribe might not exercise every single power that a state government does, that doesn't automatically mean there's no reservation.
And they even brought up instances where Congress actually needed to get the Creek Nation's consent on certain issues, even after statehood. So their argument was, Congress itself has recognized our authority, even in more recent times.
Which is a pretty strong argument, you have to admit. But of course, the petitioner got the last word with their rebuttal.
And they really hammered on the potential consequences of affirming the 10th Circuit. They focused on what could happen to all those state court convictions of people who identify as Native American within the former Indian Territory. Would they all be overturned? What about child custody cases that were decided under state law? Would they need to be revisited under the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is, a federal law that governs those cases when they involve Native American children? They argued it would be incredibly difficult for people to challenge those old state court convictions, and that retrying all those cases would be a logistical nightmare.
Right. They basically ended where they began, arguing that any tribal authority over non-native owned land or over non-tribal members ended when Oklahoma became a state. It was a pretty clear and consistent position throughout.
So I guess now we put on our 10th justice robes and deliver our verdict.
From the talk testimonies bench, I think we'd have to side with the 10th Circuit, affirming their judgment. Our reasoning really comes down to that bedrock principle that to disestablish a reservation, you need clear, unambiguous action from Congress. And, as much as things have changed in eastern Oklahoma, as much as tribal authority might have been diminished over time, the legal arguments presented just didn't convince me that Congress ever formally and explicitly did away with the Muscogee Creek Nation's reservation. Allotting the land, extending state law, those were hugely consequential actions. But under Supreme Court precedent, under cases like Solem, they just don't meet the legal bar for disestablishment.
So it's a win for the idea that it takes a very high legal standard to prove a reservation is gone, and it really emphasizes the importance of that clear expression of congressional intent.
Absolutely. And I think it also underscores that, legally speaking, whether or not a reservation exists is a separate issue from the very real, very complicated jurisdictional questions that come up in a situation like this.
Right, and that's where things might get really interesting. As some of the justices pointed out, it might take intergovernmental agreements and maybe even further action from Congress to really untangle all of those jurisdictional issues and provide clarity for everyone involved. It'll be fascinating to see how things unfold.
This is a case that has the potential to reshape the legal landscape, and it'll be crucial to follow how those practical challenges are addressed.
Well, folks, that's our deep dive into Carpenter v. Murphy. I really hope this has given you all a better understanding of the arguments and the potential impact of this really significant case.
We always love unpacking these complex legal issues with you, and we hope you found it both informative and, maybe even a little thought-provoking.
As always, a quick reminder that our analysis, including our hypothetical judgment from the 10th chair, is just that, hypothetical. It's for discussion purposes only and doesn't represent the actual views of the Supreme Court or constitute legal advice. We're here to learn and discuss, not to tell you what to think. So please share your thoughts, your questions, anything that came up for you during this episode. We always love hearing from you.
And until next time, keep those legal minds engaged.
Thanks for joining us on Talk Testimonies.